Hello, everyone. David and I have known each other for over 20 years.
26.
Whoa. Well, we lost touch for a few months at various times. We were roommates together and slept in bunk beds for 3 straight years. So our formative years were very, very in sync. I don't like saying where I went to school. He went to Harvard. So he wanted you to know that. So we've known each other forever. I, at the time, wanted to be a talk show host, so I will sort of play Conan tonight to interview David especially about the second book, which I think has a fascinating and unforgettable thesis at its core that can be applied not only to the things he mentions in the book, status and culture, but really to just about anything in culture moving forward. So after a bit of a discussion, I'm going to throw at David a number of cultural phenomena that have started since the book and ask him his thoughts on them. And I would love to invite the audience, even before the Q&A, to think of a cultural phenomenon that interests you, and we will apply the status and culture logic to it. David, how was your trip to Europe?
It's been great. This is very, very embarrassingly my first time in Paris ever. I'm just a kid from Pensacola, Florida.
Yeah,
made it here. So it's wonderful. It's a beautiful
just a
city,
kid from small town Tokyo.
Yes, but I live in Tokyo. And I've been there for 20 years, and it's a great place. But it's very far away. It's about 12 hours to get to Europe or the U.S. So it's a long haul. But it's wonderful. We were in Milan before,
yes,
and we went in the right order. Enjoyed Milan, but then Paris is it's bigger. So
it's good to go in ascending order in Europe. They
exactly.
Say. All right. Now, in the book, Status and Culture, 2 quick questions before we really get into it. What is status and what is culture?
Right. So these are 2 of maybe the worst words in the English language, especially culture. And so they have lots of different meanings. I think it's important to be really clear about what I mean with both of them, or otherwise none of it makes sense. And so we'll start with status, which is there's kind of a thought, and especially if you go back to 1950s, there's a book called The Status Seekers by Vance Packard, and there's this whole idea about status, and it mostly meant middle-class people buying expensive cars in order to outdo their neighbors. And what I mean by status is that in a more kind of sociological sense, that you have you're in a group, whether it's your family or workplace, and you have a position in that group and in a hierarchy. And as you move up, you gain more benefits and people treat you better. And so there's just a natural human desire to move up that hierarchy in your group. And then within society, all of these groups are also in this loose hierarchy. And so the groups themselves kind of struggle against each other to move up and get more respect and get more of the benefits and resources that society provides. And so if you look at these basic principles and mechanisms that spin out of this very basic desire for respect and esteem and then access to resources, which are all completely logical and rational things to want, then you start understanding where a lot of cultural phenomenon come from. And then when it comes to culture, again, this is a word that can mean high culture, it can mean pop culture, it can mean the organizational values. There's a book called Cultural Rules that's all about Netflix. So it's a pretty terrible word, and there's whole anthropological books that just list out every single possible definition that's ever been given. There is no standard definition for culture. And for me, in looking at, let's say, the contrast between culture and nature, so nurture and nature in terms of biology and human development, then culture is the part that comes out of society, that we learn. And then when you look at, let's say, economic thinking versus cultural thinking, economic thinking tends to be rational. And what cultural thinking is, it's not instinct, it's all based on convention. So conventional thinking. And what I mean by convention, and I talk a lot about this in the book, and I think it's the best way to chart culture is through these conventions, is that conventions, culture is the arbitrary parts of life. There's different things we can eat, we can wear, but we choose to, and we're pushed into certain patterns that are held in place by these conventions and mutual expectations. And so the arbitrary parts of life that are held in place by mutual expectations are conventions, and the conventional way of thinking and the way that value is created through these conventions is the cultural part of life. So culture is conventions, more or less. And so status determines which of these conventions take on value, and how we take meaning from them and how we use them in our identities, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really impossible to understand culture without understanding its basic status framework.
That was about as succinct and complete a definition of those words as I think have ever been uttered. I did not know you would be that good at that, even though I loved the book. That's excellent, and A+. Now, what I think is the amazing insight in your book is how important and how purely it is possible to view culture through the lens of status in a way that almost no one, including me before I read the book, thought of culture. I think we think of culture, which I take to mean, in very vague shorthand, the arts, how you dress, what music you listen to, all of the choices that define your personal taste and your lifestyle that you have control over in your community, in your personhood, that those feel like they come from some high spiritual place, and in fact they are far more traceable to our innate drive for status than we ever thought. What do you think other people have said before this book about the relation between status and culture?
Right,
then what do you see differently?
So in the book, I look at this connection as explaining, signaling and taste and identity and subcultures, class culture, art, fashion in terms of how these things change over time, history, why some things become traditions and some things just fads, and then look at the internet as well. And so, until now, the most famous thinkers on status have been Thorstein Veblen, and with conspicuous consumption, and that's what I think people think of when they think of this topic, and it's very cynical, which is just to say, I'm going to buy a car that is 200,000 euros, so I show people I can buy a car that is 2,000 euros. And it's very strategic and cynical, and people think it's very simple, and it's very easy to say on a personal level, and I think we all feel this, if you buy a car like that, you would say, well, I did not buy it to show that I'm rich. It's just the most beautiful car
and
I've ever seen.
This is what you refer to as the alibi.
This is the alibi. And the idea of the alibi I got from Jean Baudrillard, but he, I think, took it from Roland Barthes. And this idea that we tell ourselves that we are doing things for non-status reasons. And it's very important, and we can talk about that later, why some status symbols fail is that they don't have good alibis. And the best status symbols have great alibis, like this car just has the best motor that's ever been made, so of course I will spend more money on it. But so Veblen is a little too cynical, and it's a little too straightforward, and it absolutely does not explain everything. And then Pierre Bourdieu, I think, did a great job of saying the love of, let's say, abstract art versus representational art is not random. It's most definitely determined by education. It's determined by a certain social position, and therefore our tastes in a very deep level that we can't understand, which he calls the habitus. This habitus is formed by our background, and our class background shapes these tastes. And so that's really useful too. At the same time, I think you can go even further, which is to say any subculture, or let's say any marginalized community, is going to create a bunch of tastes that are only created in their sense of struggle against the parent. And so that, if you ever read Dick Hebdige or any of the subcultural theory, that all comes out of that. And so the most important thing is there are cynical things we do for status, and it shapes our tastes, but it also so infects us at a subconscious level. And I think a lot of economics and neuroscience are now finding this. For example, if you show someone, I forget this specific experiment, but more or less, if you tell somebody a bottle of wine is expensive, not only will they say it tastes better than the one that's cheap, but they can actually see in people's brains and fMRIs that it's registering more pleasure knowing that it's expensive. And so if those forces are working on us, and just the basic psychology of humans and how we deal with stimuli, it is impossible that we'll ever be able to purely deal with a set of stimuli that is not based off of our educational background or our experiences. And so ultimately, there's just this subconscious status layer that we're thinking about everything, and the way everything's come to us has come to us through a status framework, that it's impossible to make judgments without it. And so I talk in the book about status value, that things have a status value. And it's difficult because if you ask someone what is the status value of this, and it's different for different people, but also many people will deny it and say, I don't listen to Radiohead because of status, it's just my favorite band. But there's no way that you can ever know whether they liked it, not knowing how people that they respected that music, and it came to them in certain contexts. And so most certainly as a kid, there were a lot of things the first time I heard it, I said, I don't like this. So I'll give you some specific examples. The Pixies or Dinosaur Jr. or bands like this that just seemed very strange to me when I was 12. But some older brother or record store clerk made me feel like I must know this, and I will listen to it 10 or 12 times. And by forcing myself to listen to it over and over again, I started to like it. And so things that status value of wanting to be accepted as someone who understood these groups ultimately made my brain just like these things on a non-cynical, non-conscious level, enjoy them. So status just infects everything, and it's so difficult to talk about because we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to ever admit that we're after status. And yet it's impossible to make a judgment that removes it.
Well, one thing I found revelatory and frightening about the book is that no one is immune to this. And I feel that when you mention the $200,000 car, I imagine there might be someone in this room who's capable of owning a $200,000 car. You don't have to put your hand up. But that person who is at the American Library in Paris to attend a literary event would never drive such a car, which is also a status decision.
Can I
and that is where the book really took off for me.
So my parents, I grew up I was in Oklahoma and then Mississippi and Pensacola, Florida. My dad's an academic, and we always had a Volvo station wagon. We drove a Volvo station wagon, and my parents said, it's the only safe car. Every American car, you will die as soon as it flips over, but the Volvo is safe, and that's why we have the Volvo. And then I started reading about Volvo's marketing materials from the 60s, and the entire point of Volvo was American cars are in this ridiculous status hierarchy where every brand had a certain status value, and you knew exactly what someone's salary was based off of whether they had a Plymouth or a Cadillac or whatever it was. And so all of these intellectual people, upper middle class people who wanted out of that, wanted something else. And so Volvo and Volkswagen had the entire campaign saying, our cars never change. There's no planned obsolescence. It'll be exactly the same. It'll be just as ugly next year as well. And so buy a Volvo. And my parents, there's no way that did not affect them. They wanted out of that American car system so badly, and Volvo was there for them and gave them the perfect alibi. It's the safest car. And I confronted them about this. I was like, no, it was a taste choice. And they're like, yeah, maybe. But they'll stick until for the longest time that it was about safety. So anyway, it's what's so difficult and
safety was the alibi. But if it turned out that Mercedes was an even safer brand, even if they could have afforded it, they might not have done it.
Right.
Because this is the distinction that a lot of people refer to as new money versus old money, which you also talk about in the book, that at a certain level, people want to show their status with sort of flashy things. And on another level, which is often thought of as old money, people go the extra mile to hide it or to mimic the authenticity of people they feel have a different type of cultural status that is not wealth.
Right. And so new money, it makes a lot of sense that if you were of lower status and you suddenly get into money, money itself does not get you status. So you have to convert it to things that get you status. And for most people who are new money, you may have not grown up with a lot of education, and you actually may not know what old money is interested in or what their markers of wealth are. And so you think, well, the most expensive car, the biggest house, a boat. And so new money makes a lot of strategic sense, which is the easiest way to gain status very quickly, and especially impress your old community, is to buy things that are very expensive and show them off and be ostentatious and conspicuous. Old money, it seems to me that old money is parasitic on new money in the sense that old money's fashion wouldn't necessarily be so muted if they didn't have the competition from new money. So new money shows up, and they say, okay, yeah, we don't do ostentation anymore. And if you look through societies in which you don't have a lot of mobility, you'll see that the top class in these places is just still ostentatious, because you can prove I'm the richest because I have the most expensive car. But then suddenly, if new people show up saying, well, I have an expensive car, am I the highest status person? And old money can say, no, you're not, because it is not the money you have, it's the time that you've spent having money. And so things that have a patina, things that you can prove, oh, I've had this for a very long time, to have an estate, that is really what we should judge status on. So old money changes the rules to make sure that consumption itself can't be the judge, because they will lose, because new money usually has more money than old money. So old money style is completely strategic as well. Then you have the upper middle class professionals who, number one, their whole world and bread and butter is information and knowledge, and they know pretty well what old money's up to. They maybe went to school with them, and so they'll copy that a little bit, and then they'll also want to show off their knowledge. We were talking today about Perrier at some point, when I guess this is the late 70s, early 80s, yuppies start going to France, and they have Perrier, and they come back like, I had this amazing water called Perrier. And then, of course, that becomes, super popular in America, and they start importing it, and then it has no cachet anymore, and they move on. But, you have to show off your knowledge, and that's what the professional class is about. But they also hate the nouveau riche, and they want to say, well, it's not money alone. So the professional class also has this very anti-conspicuous consumption streak, because in their struggle with nouveau riche. So your class position sets your tastes, and it's I think that's the chapter where everyone starts feeling very weary about my book. They're like, I feel a little too seen here, but it's tastes. And this is a very, very Bourdieu idea, but yeah, those tastes are formed from the strategic status signaling needs, and brands, of course, show up in order to perfectly match what those needs are.
Well, we were talking about this brand today, Laura Piana, which had a moment this past week when Jeremy Strong, the actor from Succession, was pictured in a $500 baseball hat with the brand's name barely visible on it, which is taken to be one of the best examples of stealth wealth, which is a term I'm suddenly hearing a lot of. Is that related to the things you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, stealth wealth is that same old money strategy. It's just now, old money kind of doesn't exist, especially in the United States, as much. It's not as strong. And if you go to a university like we did with a lot of old money people, the kids of that are all trying to be billionaires now. They're not trying to just be happy with their trust funds. So old money is just not as influential as it used to be. And at the same time, these actors who can buy very expensive things are... I'm not including you. So actors can go to Laura Piana and buy Laura Piana, and they can buy a $500 baseball cap because they can, and they can be subtle about it, and they also know that everyone on the internet will identify exactly what it is for them, so they don't have to do it. But they also, when you look at luxury brands, all of them they take their power from who they are associated with. And so brands try really, really hard to give you the advertising to give specific people to say this perfume smell is this human being who happens to be high glamour. And the problem the brands have is the people that buy these goods aren't always as high status as the spokespeople for them. So over time, if you start seeing some brand overly associated with a group you do not consider high status, these brands have a crisis. And one of the things with logos is that then there's a lot of great research on this, is people who are going beyond their means to buy luxury goods tend to be more logo driven, then they're buying the bigger logos, so therefore the bigger logos start getting associated with maybe a lower status customer for these brands compared to what the brands want to give you the sense of the imaginary customer. And so then that again creates a need to distinguish oneself from the logo-driven customer, and so then you have this non-logo brand. And so stealth wealth is exactly the same old money, new money dynamic. It's just that we don't live in a world anymore where it's old money, new money. It's different shades of new money kind of battling each other.
Another thing that we were talking about, actually we talk about a lot, and I wonder how the book or how your thoughts really can sort of explain a larger cultural phenomenon that both of us are somewhat obsessed with, which is that the culture seems to have slowed down or stagnated to a huge degree compared to when we were kids. In 2001, if you looked at a movie from 1991 or 1981, the music was so drastically different. The movie stars were so different. The fashion was so different. Everything was so different. If you even look at, I've seen pictures from 1994 and thought, wow, no one from 1989 could have imagined 1994. Tupac Shakur and Kurt Cobain and Pulp Fiction. You think of 1989. That was a 5-year period, right? In the past 20 years, I couldn't tell you what year the Bourne Identity is from, but it really could be from any time in the past 20 odd years. Beyonce has been at the top of the charts for maybe 20 years, if you include Destiny's Child. Leonardo DiCaprio has been kind of a young, hot movie star for about 25 years. Yeah. I mean, the culture has really, with some exceptions all the time, but really codified and slowed down. And I wonder if you think, obviously, the internet and the iPhone is a great first suspect here, but how does status have any role in explaining that?
And has anyone seen The Big Chill? It's a great movie. So I believe that is 1983, and it's 15 years. It flashes back to 1968, and the whole idea is we were all 1968 radical hippies, and look at us, we're 1983 yuppies. So that's 15 years, right? And then if you go back from 15 years from 2023, you went to 2006, in which the biggest musical artist was Taylor Swift. And if you watch like The Bourne Identity from 2002 or something, nothing in that movie will mark you as like, oh, that was so 2002. So
the sunglasses, I've noticed.
Some of the hairstyle.
The one thing, if you watch a movie from the early 2000s, they're wearing those like, round little mini Oakleys, and that's the only tell. Yes. Everything else is the same.
Right. So there has been this stagnation, and there's been all sorts of theories, and certainly the internet is to blame for some of it. And how does status intersect with this? And so the last chapter of my book kind of looks at that, and it's somewhat tenuous, but I'll try to explain, which is things have status value. The things that are cool have status value. And we live in a world now where it is so easy to make things. It's never been easier to not only make media, but to broadcast it to everyone. And so I think something like 200,000 songs are uploaded every day to Spotify. The technology that you have for free probably to make music that is professional quality is never been more accessible. Films, so we made films in college, and literally, we borrowed cameras, these little video cameras from the university, and then we made the film and edited it on their video, and it was like, great, how do we show it to people? It was like, I guess you could send it to a film festival.
No, we rented out a theater and got people to sit down and watch a 20-minute video cassette.
And they watched it once. Right? So
we spent a year making.
Yeah. So now it's like you just put it on YouTube and everyone can see it around the world. So anyone can make content. And what has happened, and the idea was like, well, we're going to go around the gatekeepers and there's going to be this incredible explosion of creativity. But instead what's happened is only, if you think about this idea of the long tail and the distribution of content, which is you have this long tail of micro things, but you have the head still mainstream, is that everything in the last 20 years has been pushed back to the head, so only mainstream things have enough relevance and meaning that they can be used in culture to have some sort of social relationship with someone else. So if I'm wearing a brand that if you know what it is, you would know what it means about me, but none of you know what it means, then it means nothing. And so there's so much culture produced now that comes into the world with zero cultural value, whereas these mainstream movies and actors and people from the past still have incredible cultural value, and relatively they have so much cultural value. So things that are coming out of the 20th century at a time where there was fewer things and scarcity was still there, have retained their value in an incredible way, and nothing created now can compete against it. And so I think we're in that kind of crisis, and that this status value, and especially just the coolness, the idea that one would want to associate themselves with it. When we saw Tarantino in '94, it wasn't just like, that's a cool movie. It's like you wanted to go around being like, I love Pulp Fiction, and that says something about me. I'm into indie film. But, there's fewer things made like that, or they're made by the people who came up in the 90s, then we're still associating with them. So it's a complicated situation. I don't know how to get out of it in the sense that only more things will be made next year. Every barrier towards production will only go down. So how is it that we're going to create this cultural value for the things that are created?
Another thing I've heard you say that I think is really interesting is that there is a much more of a cultural consensus about popular things than there was when we were kids. So back then, Guns N' Roses would be very popular, and then 6 months later, Guns N' Roses sucks. Nirvana's cool, and if you die, I guess you're in heaven forever artistically. But generally, the top musicians and celebrities would be overthrown constantly by the next round of people. And there would always be a counterculture. So if Madonna was very popular, it was also very cool to hate that kind of thing. And now, or Tom Cruise, and now it feels literally, it's still Tom Cruise, top movie star in the country, 30, 40 years later.
Does he still do Mission Impossible?
He still does Mission Impossible. Okay. And back then, if you were cool, you liked, I don't know, some indie actor. And now, whether you're mainstream or cool, everyone loves Tom Cruise. Except, on the other hand, there is also everyone who is beloved is constantly trolled to death on the internet too, but that's also baked in as well. That's just the haters. How do we break free from that without it getting ugly, or should it just get ugly?
Well, yeah, if you go back to any of these avant-garde art movements, they were all created in opposition to the thing that came before, and that was where they got their power. And as soon as, there's a great book of interviews with Marcel Duchamp, I think a couple years before he died, but he made it very clear, everything I'm doing is because I hated Picasso and Matisse. If I could destroy their art and devalue it, that was the dream. All these movements were always in opposition to the previous one. They wanted to knock them down. And when we were growing up, and I was a little bit more militant about this than you were, but the idea was you can't listen to Paula Abdul or Color Me Bad. These are terrible. This is terrible music. If only this college rock band of Sonic Youth should have a hit. And so you were into this music that you wanted to champion, and you wanted it to destroy the mainstream music. It really had this hate that powered it. And Lollapalooza was an alternative tour to these big Michael Jackson concerts or whatever it was. And then that continued through the 90s, and I think a couple of things happened. And one, on a rhetorical level, was the rise of poptimism. And this was a generation of critics who made a very, very smart point, which was when the Strokes came out, or the Hives, someone said, well, that's real music, but Missy Elliott, that's not. That's just dumb pop. And anyone who had listened to the Strokes, it's this is such a retread of so many things that come before. And then you listen to Missy Elliott, it's no one's ever heard music like this. This is so innovative. Why are we giving so much attention to white rock bands, white male rock bands, and not this other group? And so this initial wave of what became known as poptimism was a really important corrective, which is that it made critics take this set of music more seriously. So just because it's popular doesn't mean it's bad. Because when I was growing up, because it's popular, it must be bad. And so that was the corrective. But then something happened, which I call ultra-poptimism. And it didn't come from the critics. It came from the fans. But the fans said, the thing I like it, so therefore it deserves recognition, just like anything else, and you cannot criticize it. And I think this is really, there's not only these fan groups who are often cult-like, and somebody gave Taylor Swift a pretty good score on Pitchfork, and she got death threats for not giving it a 10.0. So these groups can get out of hand, but more or less ultra-poptimism says the most popular things are the best because it means the most people like them. And so that kind of logic has opened up, and two things happened is that really infected the militant people of my generation, so they also don't want to be scolds to say, I don't like that movie because it was very big. Well, Oppenheimer obviously is terrible because so many people saw it. Nobody wants to say something so silly, so we're open to, let's talk about Barbie because it's and not talk about indie films. I also really believe there's opportunity costs. Anytime you talk about some pop cultural thing and you're not talking about another one, the other one loses. And so the militant years, we had people talking about indie records that no one had ever heard and when no one would ever champion and no marketing budgets were behind, instead of pop things. And now we're spending all of our time talking about pop things, and I think ultimately we're trapped because there's too many indie things, as I said before. None of them are relevant. So if you went up to somebody and said, I'm into this band, they would have no idea what you're talking about. And that wasn't true in the 80s and 90s where there's a small number. And so the only thing that you really can have social communication about, or you can have a nuanced hot take about or something, are these mainstream properties. And the mainstream properties, therefore, just kind of dominate our consciousness. So I am... if there's some project that I'm really interested in going forward, it's how do you restore some sort of media and critical ecosystem that can reward things on the margins without necessarily using scolding mainstream audiences as your motivator and engine. But it's difficult because I remember a conversation even 15 years ago. I met two people who were into cool music, and we were just trading, like, do you listen to this? Like, I don't know what that is. Do you listen to this? I have no idea. And it went on for like 20 minutes, and we could not identify a single group that we all listened to or even had heard of. So in that circumstance, it's a lot easier if, the Fiona Apple record comes out. You're like, I guess I'll just listen to this, so that at least when I talk to someone, I can say I've heard it. And so there's just all these forces pressuring us to not be able to do what we used to do.
Do you have any glimpses of hope or ideas of how it might happen? Do you see any little cracks in that?
I mean, the lame cop-out answer is to say, at least now we're aware of this problem, and so we can fix it. But I think there was in the book I talk about what is the role of status in giving and imbuing value to marginal things, because so much innovation happens on the margins. It happens with people doing very strange convention breaking. Invention is breaking convention, and people who are mentally ill also break convention. And so why is it that what they do is not art? So there has to be some sort of artistic intention, but artists break these conventions. And why is it that over time, someone like John Cage is not just someone that we consider to be mentally ill, but instead say, oh, that was a breakthrough for art? And it used to be the status system played a big role, because you could be in the status system and get status for championing these people, and then having them over time influence others. And that influence comes back to you, said, I found John Cage before anyone else, and now I have higher status. And so now if these things can't get a status on a personal level, we don't have an organic mechanism for rewarding very difficult culture.
So if innovation happens at the margins, is there something to the fact that no one's really on the margins the way they used to be, if they might be economically, but they aren't sort of culturally? People aren't left out the same way when there's one big sort of communal culture in the same way. One thought that comes to mind that we've discussed is the phenomenon of Dimes Square. Are people aware of Dimes Square? No?
This is also a really embarrassing confession, but I didn't realize it was a joke on Times Square until like yesterday.
Even if you didn't know what it was,
yes, you probably knew that. Yeah. So it has something to do with dimes.
Dimes is like a diner in sort of the bottom of like Chinatown, Lower East Side, etc. And it was suddenly like the coolest, edgiest, new Bushwick type of part of New York. As soon as I heard about it, I was like, oh, if I heard about it, it's probably already over. And sure enough, it was like the next day I heard like, oh, it was over. And it like arrived and was over because the New York Times style section wrote about it like a couple months after it started, like 6 months after it started. Whereas in another generation, I feel that would have gone on for like 15 years before people caught on, and it could have actually developed a culture.
That's right. Yeah, and that is the other problem, is things get discovered so quickly that in order for something to be associated with a group, and let's say it's a high status group, and then it takes on those associations and it itself becomes high status, it has to brew in that group and only brew in that group for a long time, or otherwise you see it and you don't know how to associate that thing with a certain group. And so now, because groups are not given the chance to own things for a long time, these meanings are just fad. So, for example, it's like, let's take an army parka in the 60s. So the only people wearing these army parkas are mods. And so the army parka becomes associated with a mod, because it's a mod jacket because no one else wears them. But then if instantly fashion is like, we're gonna, H&M's gonna mass produce mod parkas and everyone's wearing them, then they're not mod parkas, they're just parkas and they don't mean anything. So it has to be that distinction of being in this group for a long time. And so the media moves so fast. And that's also why I think, again, my book always probably is clearer on this than me speaking about it. But it used to be that if you invested in a new fashion, the fashion cycle was so slow that you could authentically adopt it and say, okay, I'm going to wear olive suits because I know I'm going to be the only one wearing olive suits for a couple of years, and I'll own olive suits, and it'll be part of me. And people won't remember that I didn't wear an olive suit, and I've always been an olive suit guy, and therefore olive suits are my thing. But the problem with fashions now is they move so fast that it's going to disappear, and you're not going to anchor your entire identity on things that are going to evaporate, because we don't want to be seen as participating in fads. So if every fashion is a fad, it actually makes us really conservative, which is we stick to things that we did before. And if you go back to the 60s, which was an extreme, but you can watch a film from 1964, 1965, 1966, the lapel sizes are all different, the neckties are different, everything is different because there was this investment in we're going to do this year and we're going to do that next year. But once we have this kind of meta knowledge about how the fashion system works, people don't want to necessarily invest in fashion because they don't want to look like they're investing in fads. And if everything moves too fast, then everything has no value. So the internet really conspires on multiple levels against having major fashion trends like the past. We doing speed round?
We're doing speed round. I'm going to throw out a few things here, and you tell me how you would explain them through the lens of status and culture. Vaping.
One of the things I noticed about being in Paris is that you want to smoke real cigarettes because there's like a romance to it that it's like associated in your mind with Paris and being in one of these cafes. And vaping has no romance because there's no iconic figure you can think of vaping. There's no black and white photo of someone vaping. Okay, so we have a new contender, but he has to battle against...
Every kid wants to...
She has to battle against the entire 20th century of every cool musician and philosopher with a stick of tobacco between their fingers. So vaping...
But wouldn't that be a signal that it's a good thing to try if you want to be a rebel and overthrow? Wouldn't Duchamp smoke a vape if Picasso had smoked a cigarette?
But I think vaping is overly associated with kind of strip mall stores. And there's no romance to vaping. Mm-hmm. But maybe it's functional.
There's no signaling that the person wants to do.
Yeah, there's no identity that I have a distinctive identity because I'm vaping and you aren't.
Emily in Paris.
Never seen it.
But you are aware of it.
I'm aware of it.
By the way, now explain I've never seen it to Emily in Paris. What does that say about status and culture?
Do I have to watch it? There's so many things I feel like I have to watch, and that was one. It's like that's a line too far. I mean, if every review is like this show is terrible, but I love it, it's like I'm not doing this. I don't know. I mean, you have strong opinions, which is it's a second screen show.
I was fascinated to learn, as someone who works in television, I heard people referring to the second screen phenomenon that writers need to be aware of, that people are watching on two screens. What I found out only recently, which was chilling, is that they mean the TV screen is the second screen, not the phone. These are shows to be designed. People are mainly on their phone, and there's also a TV show on. I was already upset that they'd also be on their phone. But no, we're the also in the second screen, and Emily in Paris is a very good show for that. But if you look back 50 years, the soap operas were invented so that people could wash the dishes, and they had very obvious plots and obvious acting specifically so that people could do housework and have it on in the background. That's sort of a second screen too. And now we could, valorize classic soap operas if we chose to.
Yeah, I mean, not having a show where every line is mumbled and you have to turn the subtitles on and you have to go back and figure out what the plot point was in order to understand,
Okay, so here's another speed round. Subtitles. Leaving the subtitles on.
I mean, I think that's a product of just that the audio quality has gotten so bad and it's hard to hear. And also the shows like a Succession or something are so dense with information. You have to read it in order to understand the plot points, or at least makes you think that you have to do that.
But isn't it interesting? Wouldn't you think that subtitles would signify sort of an intellectual bent? It's harder to enjoy a show with words on it.
Well, interestingly, in Japan, every TV show has these like bad subtitles. Like they're subtitles, they just like write the words as they say them, and they're not subtitles. They're big, colorful, like balloony letters. And that was because they would be on in a bar and the sound would be off, so people could kind of follow what was going on without hearing it. Or old people may not be able to hear it very well. But yeah, that coming to America was a surprise. That's new.
Hamilton.
I've never seen it.
But I'm not asking what you think of it. I'm asking the phenomenon of... let me refresh you on the book.
Yep.
Because I feel like you're just hanging out with me in Paris now.
I thought we agreed on the topics.
No, but in context of you, the theoretician, if that's the word, the author. So the phenomenon of status impacting culture and status impacting what we like, what we don't like, what we associate with, the cars we drive. What have you noticed about Hamilton?
Okay, what I've noticed as someone who's never seen it and only knows the phenomenon...
That's fine.
I'm just giving this preface so you could be like, well, he's never seen it. Is that...
You're so desperate for people to know that you're not one of those basic bitches who saw Hamilton.
Yes.
I loved Hamilton.
It's fine.
But see,
I'm
to me, that's rebellious now to say, like, I love Dice, I'm a populist.
So what I knew about it is, like, the producers, it was a hard ticket to get on Broadway, and then people were being, at one level, it's like, you had to be a special person to get it, and then the annoying people in your lives were on Instagram be like, look at these tickets to Hamilton, third row, and you're like, oh, God. So I think over time,
so
like
you
any
were
fashion...
offended by their status,
yes,
and then you chose the status of those people are lame.
Yes, totally. So...
So none of this has anything to do with the play. All of these opinions are about status.
Exactly. So the play could be great. But then over time, I think the annoyingness of the phenomenon did leak into how people interpreted the play. Because at the very beginning, I heard, oh, this is so innovative and incredible. And now it's like, oh, God,
so
Hamilton. Yeah, it's so corny. So I do, that's a great example also of just where the status value wears out. I mean, things that are great maybe can survive a dip in status value, but it certainly doesn't help. The status value is boosting the artistic value in a way we can't see. And in the case of Hamilton, the fact that the third most annoying person you know is posting about it on Instagram makes you probably like it a little less.
I grew up, to call back something you said earlier, I loved Paula Abdul. And I grew up...
She's now so iconic.
But we grew up in different, sort of opposite environments in the sense. I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, which, if anybody knows, is a very liberal, academic town that would very much... sniff their nose at anything pop culture. We're far more refined than that. So for me, it was rebellious to like pop culture. You grew up in a town you regarded as not that.
Yeah.
I don't mean to speak for you.
No. And
you grew up in Pensacola, Florida, where seeing an indie film, a Jim Jarmusch movie in a theater, was difficult in a real act of identity.
Yes.
The same way for me not seeing that was.
But then also, we are.
Although I did that too.
We are the same age, but I have an older brother and sister who are very Gen X, and you were the oldest. And you were a little more Gen Y. And I remember, I tell this story to everyone about, like, me and my roommates and the big thing that happened.
Is there a Gen Y?
Or like it's kind of
There's
like early
millennial,
millennial,
which I'm
early
older
millennial.
than that, and
yeah, it's sometimes called Gen Y.
That's perfect.
Yes. So I remember going to college and being like, okay, I'm going to college. That's where everyone listens to cool music, and like you guys are into Pavement, right? And then that continuing for about a year, and then in 1998 being called into our roommate's room. He's like, you got to see this. And like, we go in, and he's downloaded the entirety of Britney Spears One More Time. And he's like, watch this. And we watch it, and then everyone is like, oh my God, that was the greatest thing I've ever seen. I was like, we're not doing this, are we? We're not going back to pop culture. We had eradicated it. Nirvana won, people. Lollapalooza. And it was like, nope. And then, a year later, we're going to the dance, and it's Backstreet Boys. And everyone's so happy. They're like, we can have fun again. We don't have to pretend to like this mumble music. But I think there was this big generational divide between us, me and you, that kind of came from that.
Right, but I think we were defining, and it's impossible to know what your real taste is, which is one of my favorite takeaways from your book. It's impossible to know what your real taste is when all of us are wired to define ourselves in terms of status, and our taste is such a reflection of that.
Yep.
We should take some questions.
Is that a word question time? Okay.
If you have questions or other speed round cultural phenomena to
That's
throw.
right. We also
David, please
allow
raise your
speed
hand
round.
very high, and Alfonso will bring you the microphone.
Hi guys, how are you?
Good.
Thank you for being here. So a lot of what you were kind of talking about, I've been studying a lot for the past 6 months. I'm working on my master's thesis right now. So I've been going through a linguistic rabbit hole as well as kind of a political and cultural movement rabbit hole. And I keep going back to Guy Debord's Society of Spectacle. That's been like really hooking into me. And it seems that with like this linguistic explosion, like our amassing lexicon of cool things and pop culture, we keep getting into the rabbit hole of like everybody speaking a different language. And language is the basis of communal understanding between people. So if we're all speaking so many different languages, where is even a common point to get to start, right? I know you kind of put that out there at the end of your book as what are we going to work through, what are we going to do? So is there a point now that we have to look at actually just the basis of like how do we generate communal culture? How do we generate communal language? That seems to be like the answer that most of us who are studying this want to get to.
Well, I would throw in emojis. I would include those as part of language. I really would. And I think that is actually an example of an odd case where culture is evolving rapidly in opposition to other things. And there is so much signaling in terms of, do you end a text with a period?
Right.
Do you put two
So
spaces
aggressive.
after the period, God forbid?
Thank you, period. It's just like a middle finger.
I noticed a lot of younger people, when they type something that they are a little self-conscious to say, because it's so honest, they add LOL. At the end. So there are a lot of things that are in total opposition to something that even someone 3-5 years older would type like, let alone their parents' generation, in a way that music and movies are not changing that rapidly. Language is how do you feel about language as culture in this context?
Can I take a different answer to him?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
That was my answer.
So, I mean, the thing that's interesting to me about culture is its conflict, like the group's conflict, and the group's conflict is creative. So the idea that we need a communal culture just means you have a monoculture and it's static and boring. So I don't think that's interesting. I think of culture as an ecosystem. That's the best way to understand it. And most people in this ecosystem actually want very straightforward culture. That's just slightly different than what came before. So they don't, maybe they don't know so much about the world. They have very simple harmonic understanding of music and film and all these things, and they just want something that's slightly different, and that's fine, and that makes everyone happy. There's people on the fringes who, for some status reason, really need to create these new forms of culture that create their community in distinction to the mainstream society, or there's people who are just, let's say, avant-garde and want to keep pushing what culture can do. And those people and the fans of it need more stimulus because they just understand the meta workings of culture more. And so until now, we've thought about it as one of these is the best form of culture. The optimists say because things are communal for everyone, that therefore better and they should replace the difficult things. And the difficult people say no, because culture needs to always be pushing boundaries and be symbolically complex and novel. Then we need those kind of things. But they all work together. And I think about country music a lot. So country music is generally a very conservative set of conventions, but it's been going strong for so long precisely because it takes whatever is on the fringes eventually and then reinvents itself. So country takes a bunch of folk influence and then it becomes rock and roll and then it becomes alternative and now it's using trap and hip hop beats in order to be, and it's never been more relevant, right? This summer, some of the biggest hits were country songs. And so mainstream culture needs things on the fringes in order to refresh itself. And most certainly the culture industry needs those things. So I don't think the ideal state is, hey, everyone gets along. You need some conflict, but those conflicts should be symbolic, like play. They should be, I like this kind of melodic meter and not this one, rather than the kind of horrible socio-political conflicts we have at the moment. So, and then one of the things we didn't talk about, because God, we don't want to talk about it, is just the cultural divide in the United States right now between blue and red, or however you want to divide it, is so enormous that everything and all culture gets sucked into that vacuum.
Hello. Can you hear me? Thanks so much for being here. I actually have two questions, but one of them is really quick, if I may. So I wanted to give you kind of a hypothetical situation, but this is real because this actually happened with with me. It's not that deep. But when I first saw Hamilton, I was in the kitchen cooking, and my roommates had it on, and I had no idea what it was. Like, I hadn't heard them speak about it before. I didn't even know my roommates that well, to be honest, at the beginning of this. And I was literally just cooking, and I started watching it, and I thought, this is such a good movie. And then I asked them, what is this? I mean, it was the movie, the Disney version of Hamilton. I wanted to know your take on that, and are there any situations like that, which it actually happened, in which you think that you can have taste outside of conventions?
I remember for all our talk, and Chuck Klosterman is amazing about this, about Nirvana being so seminal. I actually first heard Nirvana. It was just on the radio. A radio station was playing the whole album. I had never heard of Nirvana. And I ran and got a cassette tape and just recorded the whole thing, because I just never heard anything that beautiful. It was unplugged. I hadn't heard it. So yeah, so that definitely happens.
That
What do you think of that?
all of us.
Yeah.
And this is
Right.
this is why we're all like, well, it's not status. I was in a vacuum and I heard it and I loved it. And the truth is that it is complicated because we all have these conventions that exist in our brain, and really good art of its time, especially popular art, kind of stimulates the things that are already in our brains. And so that is in some ways not a, what I would call kind of, this is, okay, I was going to call it first order status problem, but that's really jargony. So it's not a direct form of like, this is high status or low status, and therefore I'm judging it. It's just that you have lived your life with all these things and all these experiences in which that shows up and it matches something that, oh, that's the thing I wanted. But it's still related to your background and all those issues. It's just not, I totally agree that it in no way where you're like, that seems high status and therefore I like it. It's just a pure artistic and aesthetic experience, which is wonderful. But all of our aesthetic experiences are primed by our previous social experiences, and status plays a role in that.
I can't help but think that perhaps the only way to get out of the trap of status and culture that you grew up with is to go and live someplace else. Because then you're confronted with something completely different. I mean, take the example of France. I happen to be American, and I've been here for, well, over 50 years, a long time. And I was young when I came, so easy to influence, I think. Everything was different back then. I mean, I say that it was much more different. There were more differences between the United States and France back then than there are today, obviously. I mean, everybody's watching Netflix, so that we do share much more culture on either sides of the Atlantic. But I think that, I mean, it is possible if you want to figure out what your own tastes are, the best way is to confront them with something else. And didn't you say you live in Japan?
For 20 years, yes.
Yes, you lived there for 20 years, so certainly you must have had that kind of experience.
I mean, most certainly, culture, your own culture only becomes obvious to you when you step outside of it, and that's how it works. And so a custom is something that you are completely unconscious of. If you live in Japan, you can't imagine places where people wear their shoes throughout the house. And then once you're used to that, it seems like the most filthy thing ever. To be in America and people are just wearing their shoes on their bed, like it's totally normal. So yeah, I mean, language is obviously the same. If you grow up not knowing that other languages exist, you're like, well, of course, dogs are dog. There's no other word for it. So these arbitrary assignments that exist in culture and arbitrary ways of doing things become obvious when you get out of the system. And so if you want to be a great meta thinker on culture, definitely leave your culture. Or if you want to understand yourself better and understand how these things were automatically assigned to you and they don't have to be that way, then obviously go somewhere else. But this is what cosmopolitanism is. That cosmopolitanism is not just the belief that all these different conventions are great and we should, eat all the cuisines of the world, but it's an understanding of conventionality itself, that it just means the thing I do isn't necessarily the thing that is right. It's a kind of relativism. And so when you live in different places, it just becomes obvious to you and you have that meta-knowledge. And once you have it, you can never go back. You can never put the genie back in the bottle and become a provincial person. And so going back to blue versus red in the United States, it is a cosmopolitanism versus provincialism. It's a kind of idea that the way we do it is the right way versus, well, obviously there's a plurality and that there's no reason to say that there's one right way or the other. So that's, I think, what you're describing.
Do you think you could have written this book? Would you have written it the same if you had not lived in Tokyo for the past 20 years?
No, and also where it came from was trying to understand how fashion works, and because there's theory on fashion, but I think there wasn't particularly great one book of here's the mechanism of why culture changes. And I discovered fashion from being in Japan and seeing a lot of conventions were exposed, American conventions around fashions. I mean, one of them, that's not as strong anymore, but it used to be, you would ask people oh, where'd you get that dress? Or that's a really nice outfit. They'd be like, yeah, I just found it was on my floor. It was just in my closet. I don't even know where it came from. And people would never take any intention to I dressed up. I wanted to wear this. I bought this because it was in a magazine. And then in Japan, you'd be like, oh, that's very on trend. They're like, yes, I read the magazine. I went to the store. I bought it. And because I wanted to be on trend. And it's you can't do that. You can't give it away. So I think being in Japan gave me a sense of you can have the same outcomes with different inputs. And that helped me understand how fashion works quite a bit. So. You can ask me things later.
Thanks so much for everything. So you spoke a lot about how the fact that counterculture doesn't seem to really stick anymore. And I was wondering, in order to think about this question, I think that we'd also have to think about today's economic system. And also the fact that we're in an era of communication that is quite different to 20 years prior. So given the fact that we're exposed to sort of a massive proliferation of images every day, and I'm thinking about Baudrillard, because you're familiar with him. Maybe that's what makes it so that we're so oversaturated with images to a point where nothing's ever going to really stick. So even if a counterculture is born and spans multiple art forms like cinema, painting, fashion, eventually that transgressive movement is just going to be repackaged and sold back to us in a consumable form. So nothing truly sticks out of the system and nothing really opposes the system.
I think that's true. Liberalism and capitalism have figured out how to absorb everything and absorb all differences that people manifest other than illiberalism. And so now we live in a culture in which, I call it omnivore culture. So there's basically omnivore. If you're an omnivore culture, you listen to everything, eat everything, like everything, and then or you're not. And those two groups are in battle. But it used to be that there was much more extreme, maybe parochial thinking, even on the countercultures that we're fourth internationalist Trotskyites and we hate this particular Marxist-Leninist group that's too Maoist focused or whatever. So all those groups would battle each other because they were no. And now I think everyone's how can we all get along and everything's in the system. I think, I was thinking, okay, subcultures are dead. Countercultures are dead. And then you start thinking about what's actually happening in American culture. Subcultures are very, very strong. They're just all right-wing trolls. 4chan, this is all subcultural behavior. And we just don't like it because our understanding of subculture and counterculture, you'll find these books in the library, the Teddy Boys, look how stylish they were, and hippies, they created Apple Computer, So we loved that there was this rebellion and that it shaped mainstream society with all these liberal and left values. And so now there's lots of cultural things going on that we would consider subcultural. Counterculture, it's just that they're all fascist, intolerant, illiberal, and none of those things will ever influence the fashion system the same way. There's not going to be an incel chic runway show anytime soon. What was your influence at this time? Oh, it was right-wing trolls on the internet. So there's no 4chan mood boards. So because the entire culture industry looks to more or less kind of left liberal art people and they're all aligned, those countercultures are less interesting because it kind of all exists in the system, as you said. So I mean, I definitely think there's media things also going on, but the question, there's lots of activity that's just being ignored because it's not taste-wise what works in the system. Thank you.